Hello, it's Ruby, and today I'm going to be sharing my top 25 books of 2025. All of these books were extraordinary, and I would highly recommend them, and so hopefully you can add something new to your TBR. I'm not, however, going to be sharing every single book that I read this year, which I've done for the last 10 years, I think it would be, but I'm not going to do it this year. And largely that's because I didn't have the best reading year in terms of finding great books. I really struggled, especially in the second half of the year, to find books that I really loved. And there were lots of books that I started and then didn't finish. But that is another of the kind of key problems with reading challenges, which I discussed in a video earlier this year actually. But a reading challenge doesn't account for all different kinds of reading. Like, it doesn't actually account for how much you're reading, because we don't just read books. We read odd poems, we read essays, we read plays or like extracts of plays. We dip into books, and that freedom of reading is so fun, and I think it's very human, and I really like that kind of unconventional way of reading, a kind of reading that can't be tracked by a reading challenge, which I just make a point of because those kinds of literature don't usually appear on lists of like reading wrap-ups. It kind of points a little bit to as well. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, and he talks about the word reading and how, as a word, it can signify so many different things. Like, when you use the word to read, you could be referring to, like, if you're talking about a child who's 5, and you're talking about the fact they can read, the word read is operating in a very different way to how it operates when you say that you can read, or you talk about having read a very good book. In both cases, the word read is referring to a different act, and in the same way, I do think there are different ways that we read. Like, when you read a poem, that's very different to the way that you read a novel or a piece of non-fiction, or let's say reading philosophy or sociology or anthropology. When I'm reading books like that, I tend to take a more contemplative approach, and like the way I read is different. And Charlie Strong teaches the how behind this like analytic approach to reading philosophy, anthropology, history in his Skillshare class. So the class is called Critical Reading for Personal Transformation. And in this, he gives advice on how to choose a book which fits directly with your own interests, and then the practice of active reading, and how, when you're reading these books of history, of philosophy, of anthropology, how you can make sure you're taking the most from them. It's a useful class to take if you're getting into analytical or critical reading, and maybe if this is a New Year's resolution that you have. And you can do the class completely for free if you use the link that Skillshare has very kindly provided. So the first 500 people to click on the link or scan the QR code can get a month of Skillshare for free, where you can access so many different classes. There isn't just Charlie Strong's class, there are so many classes and so many things you can learn on Skillshare. Like, if you think of a skill, there probably is a class on it. You can learn about graphic design, you can learn video editing. I personally love the classes on writing, and they're the ones I tend to do. I've also actually got a class on there all about commonplacing. This is my commonplace book. I talk about it so much, and my class is all about the history of early modern commonplacing and how you can integrate those practices and that history to create your own commonplace book and become a more curious thinker, which incidentally as well, my commonplace book is a huge essential when I am reading, because I write down quotes in here, and so whenever I come across an idea that I really love, I will write it down in here. Obviously, if I read something wonderful in a book, I want to remember it, and the commonplace book lets me do this. So yes, thank you so much, Skillshare, for sponsoring this part of the video. And just as a side note to you, I've got to say how much I love Skillshare in an age of AI, because these classes are human. They are done by humans and people who are experts in their fields, and that is the best kind of learning. So thank you, Skillshare. And I am now going to get into these wonderful 25 books. So we are going to start with my favourite book of the year, which was this one. And Then What Else? A Writer's Life by Daniel Handler, aka Lemony Snicket. These are his memoirs, and notice how I say memoirs and not autobiography. It definitely reads like memoirs instead of an autobiography. It's so funny, it's so astute, it's wise, it's witty, and it is like done in the same, well, obviously it's the same writing style as his other books because he is writing it, but you can definitely kind of still feel, like, you know, the wittiness. If you read A Series of Unfortunate Events, then you'll be so familiar with that kind of slightly sardonic voice that he has. So the book goes chronologically through his life as he grows into a writer, and the really interesting thing about this, and the reason that I loved it so much, is it's part memoir and it's part like his life, but it's also part commonplace book, because the book is also filled with passages and poems and pieces of literature that he found during his life and which helped to shape him into a writer. Of course, like, it's a writer's life, so you would expect that, but I've never seen an autobiography do this in the same way. And there is actually this one poem, it's right near the end, and I was reading this book on the train going into London, and I read this, and it's from Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, and I was sat on the train and I was like, I need to buy that anthology the second I get into London, and I did. This is the anthology, but for reference, which is also so beautiful. I love the cover, and it's got an introduction by Daniel Handler. But anyway, the poem is: stupidity, delusion, selfishness and lust torment our bodies and possess our minds as we sustain our affable remorse the way a beggar nourishes his lice. And yeah, I walked away with a reading list as well. Like, he actually includes a little reading list at the end, 13 books and pieces of literature he thinks you should read. I actually borrowed this book originally from the library, and then a couple of chapters in, I had to buy it because I just knew I would be returning to this so much. There are some books I read where I just like to dip into them on random occasions and days, and I've already dipped into this in the 2 weeks since I finished it. So yeah, if you are a writer, or if you loved the series of Unfortunate Events books as a child, this is one I would highly recommend. Like, as I say, I think it might be my top book of the whole year. Next book is Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, and I unfortunately don't have my copy because I've lent it to a friend. I also annotated it so much that I bet it was very annoying to read. So it's a vampire story. It's by V. Schwab, who of course wrote Addie LaRue, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which was the best book I read in 2023, and this one did not disappoint. It was my most anticipated book of 2025, which was definitely a close one because Katabasis by R.F. Kuang also came out, but I just love V. Schwab's writing, and this one was very similar to Addie LaRue in terms of style. That is to say that it's not the style of Vicious. I also read Vicious this year and I did like it, but it was very gruesome and very, like, if you like bodily horror, you would love Vicious. But I don't love bodily horror, and honestly, I had to keep on putting the book down because I was getting too squeamish. It was excellent, I would recommend, but and I probably will read the next one in the series. But my point is that the writing of this is slightly more lyrical, slightly less bodily, but also still quite bodily because they're vampires and there is a lot of blood in this book. It's basically 3 different women, and it cuts between their lives at different points through time. So we've got Maria in 16th century Spain, we've got Alice in modern day Boston, and we have got Lottie from, at first it's an unknown time, but it ends up being Victorian. And each of these women is like living in parallel and they're connected, but we don't know how yet. And the kind of kind of generational sort of like jumping between periods is very reminiscent of Addie LaRue, of course. I just love like the witty conversations between Maria and the widow at the very beginning. Like 16th century Spain is so vividly done, and I think V. Schwab is very great at like creating that sense of place. It's got this beautiful old nostalgia, and the whole vampire lore and the way that vampires work and the kind of metaphors that V. Schwab is drawing on are so satisfying, and like the world building itself is beautiful. Like all of the metaphors and imagery is it gives you so much to think about, and I think that's why I end up loving this book so much, because like the world building and the kind of the reasoning behind the different bits of world building were like so metaphorical that in itself, when you finish reading the book, really stayed with you. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that right, but I would highly recommend. I'm not a big fantasy person, and of course it is fantasy-ish, but it's rooted in the real world at the same time, and they go through major historical events. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. The next book is A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. This is, I think, the second James Joyce that I've read. I read The Dubliners when I was at school in year 12, and but that was a while ago, and I kind of want to reread it after reading this. I did speak about this book in quite some depth because I read it during a readathon, I think, or at least during a reading vlog. I read it during a reading vlog and gave a very comprehensive review at the time. But it's basically a Bildungsroman novel, which is to say that it follows somebody through life and shows the building of this person as a character. We start in childhood, where Daedalus is a young child, and then he goes to boarding school, and we see these kind of perceived but also very real injustices of schoolboy life, and those things that to us as adults seem so small, but which we do remember being so massive when we were that age. I think it does a very good job of like building that kind of childhood voice. And then as a teenager, we see a massive change in kind of awareness of self as he does something bad, which he then feels a lot of guilt for, and we see this massive internal battle. And I say it's a Bildungsroman novel, but this is something I did kind of explore and like touch on when I filmed that last video talking about it. But it's also not a Bildungsroman novel, because the whole thing with Bildungsroman is that you move neatly through time, but the character in this keeps on jumping back and forth, and sometimes you're not sure where in time you are. It's very like reminiscent of the whole, you know, the idea of the inner child and the fact that the child version of you is still sitting there inside, and sometimes it will come out in certain circumstances. And you definitely see that with Daedalus. Like, he'll be in a new situation and suddenly he'll be speaking like he's a schoolboy again, even though he is an older teenager or a young man. And it's so interesting, like, the way that this book plays with time. It's also remarkably and strangely, like, almost absurdly cozy in places. I can't even explain it, but I think it's because so much of it is bleak. Like, there's a lot of bleakness in this book, that when you do have those moments, like there's a Christmas morning scene, which I remember very clearly, and this image of the rain falling outside, and in those moments it does feel so like comforting and warming, because I think there's so much bleakness elsewhere in the book. I would highly recommend this. It's also not very long. I think a lot of its notes as well. Yeah, like, that's the actual book. It's not long at all. So if you're looking for a quick classic, then this is a good one to try. I'm going to do... Oh, my hair is so puffy today. I think I'm going to do just one more book because I've got a call now in like 10 minutes. This is also one of the best books from this year. Monstrum by Lottie Mills. This is her first book, but she was the winner of the BBC Young Writers Award in 2020, and it's a collection of short stories, and I would go as far as to say that this is the best collection of short stories I have ever read in my life, which is saying something. It is saying something. I don't say that lightly. It's so haunting, and it's like a Tim Burton film, or kind of that feeling of the Tim Burton film, that haunting, slightly uncanny, slightly unsettling, like kind of the strangeness, the oddness of characters in a Burton film. It's that, but in a book. And I see all the time on social media people saying, I need a film that feels like the Coraline movie, or that feels like, and they put all of these Burton-esque pictures on the screen, and this is that book. Each of the characters is different, and they exist in these societies and these communities where they are so strikingly unlike anybody else there. It says on the back, the characters in these unforgettable stories are born into a society that cannot accept their difference. Labelled grotesque, deviant or damaged, they have a choice, contort themselves into a bird or find another way to live. One of the stories is set in a circus. There's another one about a doll. Those are the two that kind of are the most memorable for me, but I will definitely be returning to this. I cannot recommend this book enough. Anyway, I'm going to go and I will film more later. It is a different day, as you can see. And I'm going to continue with my favourite books. The next one is Katabasis by R.F. Kuang, which of course was going to be in my top 25 books of the year. I adored this book. It's also beautiful. Oh my gosh, I got one of the special editions and I love the sprayed edges so much. So this is set in Cambridge and a little bit similar to Babel. This book really highlights and kind of makes a point of some of the absolutely huge injustices which exist within institutional education, especially at institutions like Oxford and Cambridge. It was actually incredibly uncomfortable to read in the best possible way. So the book is a historical novel set in the 1980s and it follows Alice Law, who is a PhD student whose supervisor dies. She is a student of magic and she decides that she wants to venture into the underworld, into this kind of like the sprawling underworld as described by Dante and other classical writers, and she wants to go and find him so that he can write her references. It's such a, like, the premise itself, just like on a really macro scale, is such a cutting and like excellent criticism of institutional education, and the whole premise of her needing to, or feel like she needs to go into the underworld to get this reference, is so ridiculous, but also it's kind of almost not surprising, which is the more shocking part. And then when she goes into the underworld, it is set up like a university, and it's got the courtyards and it's got the buildings which you would find in Cambridge, and everyone in this underworld is an academic. And so as she goes through each of the circles of hell, which are inspired by Dante's Inferno, she comes across people who've committed different sins. If you're not familiar with Dante's model, like depending on what sins you commit, you'll go to a different circle and place of hell, and each of these is different, and he describes these in his Inferno book. But she like travels through them and she sees all of the crimes that these academics have committed, which have kind of landed them in different circles of hell, and she's venturing through looking for her supervisor. So yes, very critical about institutional education. Also, like with Babel, it's pointing to some very uncomfortable truths about academia. Babel focuses on colonialism, and because it's set in an alternative Victorian Oxford, it's kind of like in the very era of British colonisation and the British Empire and things. So those themes are much more at the forefront. In this book, questions of race are very prevalent. Also, questions of misogyny and sexism within institutional education. Of course, this is in the 1980s. And if you put that in context, it was only in the 1970s that a lot of Oxford and Cambridge colleges started to admit women, and it was still a very new thing. It was only in 1965 that Cambridge amended its policies, which allowed different colleges to kind of create and change their own admissions process to admit women if they wanted to. And Jesus College, where I studied at Oxford, only admitted women from 1974. So this is all very recent stuff, and this being set in the 1980s is very much in that, like, in that historical moment of women only recently having access to this education. And so you see that, and you see the way that Alice as a woman is treated differently to her male colleagues. And it does fit a lot with kind of, I've had conversations with older academics who've spoken about studying in the 1980s and how, and I've heard like kind of stories of like very similar cultures to this. I know it's actually quite scary to read this, because the 1980s wasn't ages ago, and it kind of made me feel a bit sick at points because of like the truths that it was exposing, but like in the best possible way. And I would highly recommend this book. And I feel so bad for this book because it has got such an unwarranted negative attack on social media, like especially on TikTok. When it first came out, I was so excited, but there were so many videos on TikTok being posted where people were being so mean about this book. It's amazing. Lots of people said that it read as very academic, like it read like a textbook, but of course it's going to read like that because it's set at Cambridge. Alice is a PhD student, and I think that tone is important. I think it adds to world building. Lots of people were also saying there was a big thing last year that you had to follow this reading list if you were to enjoy this book and get the most out of it and understand it. Kind of citing books like, I think Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was on there, Dante's Inferno was on there. I can't remember others, but like there were these long lists circulating, and I think it's wonderful to read those books, but you don't need to read them to understand this. And I almost think it kind of set this book up as feeling challenging or feeling inaccessible, when it's very well written, it's very engaging, it's very fast paced. There was a little bit in the middle where it got a little bit slow, but everything is so clever and there's so much symbolism and there's so much research, and it builds on all of this classical thought, mythology, philosophy, magic systems in order to create the world here. Like, it's so based in history, and so it's fascinating to read. Anyway, the next book I've got here was another really anticipated release. Actually, this came out in 2024, I believe. Ministry of Time by Carr Bradley. I was so excited to read this. Honestly, the premise of it is so brilliant, like it's genius. Basically, the Ministry of Time is a division of the government, and our protagonist works in this division, and they have created and found this way of time traveling, and they go back to particular historical moments where somebody was about to die, and then they take them just before the moment of death and bring them to the modern day. And so they've gone back in time and got Commander Graham Gore from 1847, who died in the Arctic expedition. I'm pretty sure he was a real guy as well. I saw an interview with Carly Ann Bradley, and she was talking about how during lockdown she became obsessed with this real Arctic explorer, and how this whole book came about from that thought experiment of like thinking, oh, what would it be like to meet him, which is just so cool and such a creative method of writing as well. She's just, as a side note, she's so eloquent. It was honestly one of my favourite interviews I've ever watched with an author. So basically, Graham Gore is brought to the modern day, and one of the people in the Ministry of Time is tasked with looking after him, and he has to come back to her apartment, and she introduces this Victorian gentleman to all of these new inventions of the 21st century, and it's honestly hilarious. Like, you know when people talk about what would a Victorian child say to like an iPad, like how would they respond to it? This is that exact thought experiment, but with this very proper Victorian gentleman. So, for example, she introduces him to Spotify, and he hates Spotify because he's like, well, why should music be instantaneous? It really just gets you to completely reevaluate the things that you take for granted every day, and I loved that book. I loved this book for that. The book kind of has a Terry Pratchett element to it, like it reads a bit like Terry Pratchett. So that's kind of the first half of the book, and then the genre changes completely in the second half. I really do like books that experiment with genre that aren't just like tied to one form of writing, and this book is experimental for that reason. Like, it starts in one place and you have expectations about where it's going to go, what's going to happen, and everything turns on its head. It's so unlike anything I've read, for the way that it just crosses genre and like goes between different genres so seamlessly. In a way, and I'm not saying it's like this, but in a way it's a bit like If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. Like, not really, but it's that kind of lucid feel, if that makes sense. If you like romance, if you like Terry Pratchett, if you like sci-fi, like, honestly, this book is very wide-ranging. I kind of love that the book got me to read genres that I wouldn't usually read because they were within a book that I would read, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does. Next book is this tiny little one. This is The Tale of Beatrix Potter, and it's the Margaret Lane biography. I don't know if this is the best biography, and there is a very chunky biography of Beatrix Potter, which I really want to read, which is very detailed. But this just gives a lovely kind of quick insight into Beatrix Potter's fascinating life, and especially I think her life before she moved to the Lake District is so interesting. So she grew up in London, and she grew up in a very well-to-do family, this very proper family with all of these social rules and etiquette, and she didn't really fit into this space. If you like the Beatrix Potter books, like, just read this. It's very, very quick, and I read it whilst I was visiting her house in Surrey, in the Lake District, and I just loved it. It's such a charming book and a perfect one for spring. The next book is another very quick one, which was Goodbye Mr Chips, and this was very moving. It's about this schoolmaster who has worked at the same school the whole of his career. I think he was 20 when he starts there, and after retiring, he continued to live on the grounds in this cottage, and so the whole of his life has been around this job and this school, and he's been at this school through all of the major changes. I think he's been there for both of the world wars, or at least one of the world wars, and he's seen the world change so much. He's seen life change so much. But every single year, with certainty, he teaches classes of boys the same things. And this book kind of reflects on his career, and he's very old, and he's looking back and remembering his life. And I just love how it shows the care of teachers and how much teachers care about their students. It's something I definitely felt when I was a student. I always looked up to my teachers so much, and I really admired teaching as a profession. And I think it's funny because this man never married, and he spent his whole life at the same school, and there's an instinct from some characters in the book too to pity him and for this to be treated as like a waste of a life, but the book really shows how that's not the case at all. And he's actually seen, and the way that he talks about his students is that he's helped all of these children grow and he's watched them leave, but it's like the kind of the privilege of having educated that many young people. It's a really beautiful book, and I loved it. Next one here is The Foundling by Stacey Halls. I read 3 Stacey Halls books this year and I loved all of them, but The Foundling was my favourite. This is set in London 1754, and the whole book is kind of set around the Foundling Hospital, which you will know about if you were like me and loved Jacqueline Wilson when you were a child, because Jacqueline Wilson wrote Hetty Feather about a foundling girl. The Foundling Hospital in London was a place where destitute mothers could leave their children, and then the children would be educated, brought up, and it was a much better alternative than the workhouse. Lots of children would be sent away though. And in the book, the mother has left her baby at the Foundling Hospital, and then later she goes back to retrieve her and she wants to bring her home, and the child is gone. She's already been reclaimed. And the book cuts between this mother who's searching for her child and this wealthy woman who basically kind of adopted this child and pretended that she was hers. Stacey Halls is a historic writer, and she always explores so astutely and wonderfully the divisions between class. So cutting between chapters where you've got one very wealthy person and then a woman who is destitute, and I just think it's such a valuable way of looking at the Victorian period, because there was so much class inequality, there are so many problems in Victorian life, and kind of having these balanced and having these stories balanced and showing how they interact, I just think is so powerful, and I loved it. It was very gripping, and if you like Victorian England, you should read this. Next book is Swimming in the Dark, which is a book set in 1980s Poland, and it's about these 2 boys who fall in love at summer camp. It starts with this beautiful love story with the longing of this boy who falls in love, and in many ways I do think the beginning is very similar to Call Me By Your Name. There's a very specific feeling to Call Me By Your Name, like a melancholy paired with the heat, paired with the longing, and Swimming in the Dark felt very similar to that. It had the same feeling, but only the first half. And because this is set in 1980s Poland, when they leave summer camp, we see how this summer love kind of stays with the main character. And we see the very harsh distinction between this very wonderful summer and the kind of reality of living in 1980s Poland. The next book is Wild by Amy Jeffs, and Amy Jeffs is a Cambridge scholar of medieval literature, and Wild basically kind of rewrites and tells these medieval myths and stories, and then straight after it explains it. And so I love the combination of this really beautiful kind of fairy tale storytelling, and then straight after you get an insight into the history of the story, what it represents, the imagery, where she's drawing obviously on her expertise as a medievalist. It's just wonderful if you like fairy stories and if you're interested in the form of fairy stories. Another book I loved is A Stroke of the Pen by Terry Pratchett, which is actually the first piece of Terry Pratchett I've ever read. Apart from, actually, I read one of the Discworld books when I was 9. I saw it at an airport and I thought, I want to try this. This looks good. But then I didn't like it at all. And I was really put off. And I haven't tried him again since, because in my head I didn't like him, but obviously my reading tastes are very different to what they were when I was 9, and so I gave this collection a go, and just adored it. He's so funny, and everyone says he's so funny, but he's so funny, and it's so absurd. These are basically short stories which were never published, and they were published as a collection posthumously in 2022, I think. My absolute favourite is the Instant Jungle Powder one, which is about like this powder that you can use to grow a jungle from scratch. But all of the premises are just so funny, and off the back of this, I went on to read 2 other Terry Pratchett novels this year, which again, I loved. I read Mort. Did I read Mort? I read like the Fred one. It's like Death or Fred. And then I read Mort, I think. I'm getting very confused between titles. Another book I loved this year was Wintering by Catherine May. Definitely one of my top books. It's a piece of nature writing, I would say. I think it's like part memoir, part nature writing. It follows this woman through one winter, and she decides to leave her job and to focus only on embracing winter and almost like hibernating, but she's following the practices of kind of humans 600-700 years ago, and the way that we would follow the natural cycles and seasons. And so over the course of this winter, she learns so much about early human ways of kind of like practicing winter, and as she calls it, wintering. So for example, one thing that really struck out to me, I couldn't believe this, was obviously because during the winter it's dark for a lot of the time, and if you don't have access to electricity, then when it's dark you're going to go to sleep. And so people would go to sleep much earlier, and they'd sleep for such a long time overnight, that they would often wake up in the middle of the night, and then you'd wake up for an hour and you might light a candle and do a few little bits, and then you go back to sleep. So you'd have first sleep and second sleep, which is so interesting, and I can't believe I'd never heard of it, because apparently it was a really common thing. But the book's wonderful. It's very cozy, it's very kind of revitalizing, and it makes you feel thankful for winter. So I read it in January, and it's a book I would really recommend reading in January when you're in the depths of winter, and I think a lot of people can feel quite like enclosed by January as a month. This is the second mention of Italo Calvino this video, but next is Invisible Cities, which was actually one of the first books, I think it was the first book that I read this year, and it's just so beautiful. There isn't really plot to it as such. It's structured around this man telling, I think he's a king, about all of the places he's gone to and all of these cities he's travelled to, because he's spent his life wandering between cities. He describes all of these absurd cities that he's visited, and they are strange, they've got like weird qualities, and the book kind of just taps into the importance of space and travel, but essentially stresses that travelling is not about the place itself, but it's about how you as an individual react to the place. And obviously when you go somewhere, you become part of that place. You know the ancient Japanese proverb, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around, does it make a sound? In a way, this book kind of taps into the same philosophy, because it's this man's experiences and his thoughts and his personality that change the perspective of the city, and you become so aware of his subjectivity and the way that his experience of the city, of course, differs to so many other people's experience in the city and how they perceive it. Like, I've got my review here that I wrote for myself, but I say that kind of travel becomes solipsistic, and it becomes about yourself, and it's a very personal thing. And also that the fact that they are imaginary cities, I think it has a very different effect to if these were real ones, because if he was going around all of these cities and he was naming one as Paris and one as London and one as Tokyo, then you are approaching that city with a set of expectations, whereas because these are all made up and he's just wandering between them and you know nothing about them, he's able to construct them, and you're able to enter his framework untainted by your own assumptions around particular cities and places. Because, for example, like, the idea of Paris is a wonderful thing. Like, you've got the idea of Paris and you've got Paris, and I know that when I've gone to Paris, the idea of Paris very much infiltrates and affects the way that I then look at Paris, because I've got a set of preconceived ideas about what the place is going to be like, and it's very, I don't know, it's quite cool to not have those preconceptions about a city as he's talking about them. And I also really like the way it explores youth and aging, and how he reflects on how he's changed since he was young, as he comes across young people as he's travelling. It is a really great book, and as I say, not really plot-based, but I'd say that this is a good one if you read more for writing than you do for plot, because there are different types of readers, and I'd say overall I'm more of a writing person than a plot person, which isn't to say that I don't enjoy a good plot, but if I was choosing between the two, I'd rather have a book with very like lucid, beautiful writing than a book with a good plot. Next, I have got a graphic novel, which is unusual for me. I don't often read graphic novels. This one was so like, it's very, very sad, but also so beautifully done. And it's about this young woman with depression, and she's explaining how the world has become grey, and she's there's this big kind of like darkness that's following her, and all of this is visualized through this graphic novel. It's called, I didn't even say the name, Everything is Okay, that's what it's called. I'm pretty sure it's semi-autobiographical, and the author is explaining kind of her experience of depression through this graphic novel, but it's like the woman kind of seeking support. It's a very hopeful book, and the illustrations are lovely. The next one here is I Who Have Never Known Men. This book is very haunting, very uncanny, deeply unsettling. It's set in this dystopian world. I don't even know if you can say dystopian though. It's so unusual, and you never know what's going on, and it's really frustrating, and I'm still frustrated by this. I think about it often, and I was talking about this with my best friend, like both of us just kind of like going back and forth on what on earth did this book mean. But it stays with you, and surely that's like the hallmark of a good book. So it's about this girl who lives in a cage with 20 women, and they're locked in this cage, and they spend the whole of their lives here, and this girl has never known anything apart from this life. So inside the cage they have toilets, they have a kitchen, they've got beds, and surrounding the cage are men, armed men, who watch them 24/7. And it's like you have no idea where they are, you don't know what's happened. The other women remember a time before this, they remember like our real world, but this girl has never known anything else. As a book, it feels very claustrophobic, and it raises so many questions, but it's unlike anything I've read, and I really did love it. I also read The Amphigorey. This is a collection of the little books that Edward Gorey wrote. Edward Gorey is one of the greatest artists ever, I think. His illustrations are just extraordinary. They're so haunting, and they actually were one of the inspirations for Tim Burton. But he produced tiny picture books, which were very dark and not for children, but like they're just so weird and they're so bizarre, and it's difficult to kind of even put a label on the genre because it's just all very strange. These, like for reference, I bought an Edward Gorey sticker book, so these are the illustrations, which I'm sure you recognise. The Amphigorey was quite recently published, and it's a collection of lots of these little books that have been put together in an A4 book. I borrowed this from the library, and so I wish I could show you, but I can't. But I really want to collect some of the miniature books now, and my favourite ones were With a Hapless Child, The Gashly Crumb Tinies, and The Doubtful Guest. I think my absolute favourite is The Doubtful Guest, and that's the one I would recommend. They're so short that it feels like they're really hard to explain, and so just trust me, if you like Tim Burton, read Edward Gorey. The next book I finally read was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which has been on my list for ages. It's gothic southern horror, and when was it written, actually? It was written in 1962, and it's very strange, like very strange. The main character is 18-year-old Mary Cat, who also reads as so much younger than she is. I thought she was about 9 until her age was mentioned, but she seems so much younger, I think, because of the family dynamics and because of where she is. Basically, she lives with her sister and her uncle, and they spend all of their time in the home, like they never leave, and this is because they've been ostracised by everyone else in the community. There was a massive scandal a couple of years ago where all of the family members, like their parents and I think an aunt, all died at dinner. There was poison in the sugar bowl, and Mary Cat's sister was accused of this, and so they've been shunned by the whole village, and so they live this incredibly reclusive life in this house. And I do love a house-based horror. I feel like I love the kind of the way that it's so contained, and in many ways it reminded me of Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I wasn't actually going to talk about this book in this video, but this probably would have been my 26th favourite, honestly. I did love this, but it's similar because in both you've got the character who's contained and they live a very quote-unquote small life, but within that small framework everything gains so much significance, which I think is so fascinating. And so Mary Cat engages in all of these rituals, and so many things in the house have this almost magical significance to them. But you might be wondering, what is this book actually about? And there's this wonderful idea from John Gardner, who wrote The Art of Fiction, and he says that all stories begin with one of two things: either somebody leaving or somebody arriving. And in We've Always Lived in the Castle, their cousin arrives, and he is awful. Oh my gosh, one of my least favourite people in all of literature. Like, every time I think of him I get mad, and I kind of love the fact that a character has been written that I hate so much, but he's so horrible to read. And just the whole time he was there, I was like, that every single time he'd be in a chapter, I'd be like, please leave, I do not like you at all. But it inspires very strong emotion, let me tell you. He is horrible. He's so greedy, and he turns up at the house and he forces his way in, and he becomes part of this family unit, which Mary Cat does not like at all. But it is an excellent book. Not very long at all, and it makes me want to read more books by Shelley Jackson. So if you are a Shelley Jackson fan, please do tell me the next one to read, because I would love to read more of her work. There was also a middle grade, young YA book I read this year, which I thought was excellent. Totally Deceased by Sue Cunningham, and it's just so fast-paced. It's such a clever premise for a book. It's also a fantastic read for 12 to 14, 15-year-olds, which can be quite a difficult age range when it comes to books. So it's about this girl, Jess. I forgot her name for a moment. This girl, Jess, and she has a heart transplant, and when she wakes up from this heart transplant, there is a ghost in the corner. Her name is Tilly, and Tilly is the one who gave the heart, which Jess now has. And Tilly tells Jess that she has been murdered. So Jess has to go undercover with Tilly in high society London, because Tilly is very wealthy, she's very upper class, and Jess goes undercover to try and find her murderer and avenge Tilly's death. It's such a great premise, very fast-paced. It's maybe a little bit like A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, though also not, but it's just as readable. I would highly recommend it. Another book I loved that is on here is The Skeleton Cupboard. It's quite good at actually having notes on these books, because the last few years, usually I just have to rely on my memory and what I can remember, and that can be quite tricky when it comes to books that you read last year. The Skeleton Cupboard is a collection of stories from a clinical psychologist, and it's split over 6 chapters, and it's during her training, so she's going to different areas and different wards, and then we get her experience from each of these different places. So for example, she spends time in a geriatric ward with young people, with teenagers, and it feels very it's very psychoanalysis based, and it almost feels very neat in places. The way that she kind of explains the treatment, it's her perspective, trying to get them the best treatment and trying to help them get better, all the while supported by a not very great supervisor. And so they seem to be set out like little stories, and you really get to understand the patients. If you're even vaguely interested in psychology, I'd really recommend this. It's excellent, and I do want to buy a copy of this one. I don't have copies of all of the books to show you, obviously, because about half of the books I read are from the library, so obviously I don't have the library books anymore. Here we're down to the last few. 2 are poetry anthologies, and then there's one final novel, which is The Lighthouse Witches. However, this is the one I wrote no notes on. It's set in Scotland, and I read it whilst my mum and I were in Scotland, which was the perfect atmospheric read. Someone actually recommended it to me on Instagram when I said I was going back to Scotland, and It's set by the coast, and we were by the coast, so it was even better. And it's kind of been left in the past in terms of superstitions. So the community on this island retains a lot of the kind of beliefs around witchcraft and blaming witches. And this artist is commissioned to come across to the island to paint a mural on the lighthouse, on the inside of the lighthouse. And so she arrives, but she can feel the weirdness. She can feel the strangeness in this community, and she knows that something isn't quite right. And there is indeed magic at play, but kind of most terrifyingly, quite near to the start of the book, the main character's children go missing, and they're trying to understand what's happened. It's a kind of cuts between a few different people and a few different time periods, but it's so brilliant and very readable. If you're looking for, like, if you're going to Scotland, put that on your list. And then the final two books are poetry anthologies. I love Mary Oliver's poetry. It's so hopeful and it's so rooted in nature as well. She focuses on these, bad things like sadness or political turmoil, and she contrasts that with nature, and nature becomes this constant. And I just think her poems are this beautiful ode to nature and why we should spend time in nature and why we should be thankful for nature and why we need to protect it, but in a very unique, she does it in a very unique way. As I say, they're just beautiful, hopeful, wonderful poems, and she is one of my favourite writers. And then the other poetry anthology is Tove Ditlevson's There Lives a Young Girl in Me Who Will Not Die. She's a Norwegian poet, and I was actually kindly sent a copy of this book. The writing is kind of similar to Mary Oliver's, maybe, a little bit at least, in that it's hopeful and it's beautiful. The themes are very much around childhood, around girlhood, as you can kind of tell from the title. But like with Devotions, it takes poems from her major anthologies and sets them all next to each other. I think it's interesting actually with this one that it was very clear to me when different poetry anthologies started. So I loved her earlier works and her later works, but I didn't really like her mid-career works, which is really funny, and I can't even say why, but they just didn't resonate in the same way. They felt different to her earlier works. They are very simple poems, but really beautifully translated and composed. Listen to this. When I say simple, you'll see what I mean. I love you because your spirit flickers like a candle left by a window. I love you because when I think you're mine, the flame blows out, and it isn't so. It's very simple, but it's very moving. I thought I'd included this book in this video, and I hadn't, and I just had to really quickly also say I'm not going to give a proper review, but I read The Talented Mr Ripley, and that was also one of the best books I've read this year. I adored it. Oh my gosh. The writing is... People argue with me on this, I think, but I think the writing's quite similar to The Secret History. I think if you like The Secret History and you're looking for a book which is just vaguely similar, it's not as good and it's not the same, but they remind me of each other in terms of the writing. It's about this young man who so he's American, and he convinces this wealthy man that he's friends with this man's son, and so this man ends up paying for this guy, for Tom Ripley, to go to Italy where his son is and try and convince him to come back to America, because the father's oh, he's wasting his life in Italy and everything. So he goes and he becomes obsessed with Dickie, who is this boy, and it's it's very interesting psychologically, and you really get into the headspace of Tom Ripley, who is not a great person, to say the least, but you still find yourself in moments rooting for him, and you're like, why am I rooting for him? I shouldn't be rooting for him. It's just, yeah, it's very, very good. I'd highly recommend, especially as a summer read. Anyway, those are my top 25 books of the year. I'm sorry for not going through all of the books, but it also meant that I could spend a little more time talking about each of them, and hopefully off the back of this video you're able to find like a new book to add to your TBR. I've got to say TBR videos can be very dangerous because I always walk away from them, like when I watch them, and I have such a long list to add to my TBR, which is already like 800 books long, and I definitely don't need any more books for my TBR, and yet still I can't stop adding books, and so I'm really sorry if I've contributed to the same problem. But anyway, thank you again for watching, and Happy New Year, and I hope that you have more than just a productive week. Do you know, my instinct actually was to say, please do tell me the best book you read this year, and I really do want to know, but as I say, I'm also like, I'm nervous, I'm worried, because I know that you're going to convince me and I'm going to have this extra book on my TBR, but please do still share, because I really do want to know, despite it not being a good idea for my TBR. Honestly, one of my favourite things about being part of this community online and having this platform is the number of great books which I've been introduced to, because some of my best reads have been recommended by viewers, and yeah, so I always love a recommendation and always appreciate them. But thank you again, and as I say, I hope you have a more than just a productive week.